Hello, my name's Kate Redshaw and I'm a senior lawyer in the employment team at Burgess Salmon, and I'm joined today by my colleague, also an employment lawyer, Annelise Tracy Phillips. And Annelise, we're here to talk today about the changes which will be coming in the private sector to IR35. And of course, these changes were expected to come into force last April, but COVID stopped them in their tracks. So IR35, let's just remind ourselves, the changes are going to put an onus on end users to decide whether or not a contractor is inside or outside of that regime. And I know you were sorry when they were delayed, but it looks like your luck will change as they're coming into force, as far as we're aware, on April the 6th this year. Despite actually many attempts to pull back from them, they're not the most popular of changes, it's fair to say. But it looks like they will come in. So Annelise, perhaps we could start with a brief reminder of what these reforms are seeking to do.
Yes, and I think you're right. There's no indication that they're not coming into force, and HMRC are going full steam ahead with their information campaign. So they've got an awful lot of sort of seminars and pieces of information out there. So it really does look as though the anticipated implementation date of the 6th of April will happen. But yeah, you're right, Kate. I mean, what they do effectively is they apply to any organisation which engages contractors via relevant intermediaries, and mostly that's going to be via personal services companies. And what the reforms will do is shift the responsibility from the intermediary, that's the personal services company, to the end user to determine what tax should be paid on the fees payable to the contractor.
Sorry, and I think I'm right in saying that the new rules apply to all contractors, but there are two exceptions I think people will need to know about. Can you tell us more about those?
Yes, the first is if you're a small company, and that is a company which satisfies two or more of the following criteria. First, that you've got an annual turnover of less than 10.2 million. Second, you've got a annual balance sheet total of less than 5.1 million. And finally, less than 50 employees. And if that you satisfy those requirements, then the old IR35 rules will continue to apply to you. All companies are always small in the first year of operation. The second exemption will be where the client, that's the person who has the services provided to them, is wholly international. So if they're wholly overseas and they've got no UK operations, then again, the old rules will continue to apply to them.
Okay, thank you. And I think I'm right in saying that that second point, that second exemption, was something that was clarified within the last 9 months or so, so after that April date from last year. So yes. Before we dive into the detail of the reforms, I'm conscious that there would have been people who were quite far down the road in their preparations last year. What other changes have come in since that April 2020 date that people ought to be aware of?
Well, the final legislation was broadly very similar to the draft legislation, save in two areas. The first is to enable contractors and agencies to establish whether the end user, the client, is a small company and therefore exempt. They've been given the right to ask the client the relevant questions, and the client has to answer within 45 days. So that's the first change. The second is a technical change to expand the number of intermediaries, or the definition of intermediary to which the new off-payroll working reforms will apply. And that expanded it to include intermediaries where the contractor didn't necessarily have a material interest. And that's obviously a much broader category, but HMRC have confirmed that that's not intended to apply where the contractor doesn't have a material interest in the intermediary and the intermediary already accounts to HMRC for PAYE taxes. There will be some technical changes in the next finance bill to make that explicit.
Okay, so despite, as I said earlier, pressure on the government to kind of pull back from the reforms, actually not very much has changed at all, as you said, from last year. So people who had already put in place preparations for the implementation last year are in a good position, or should be in a good position now. But before we look more closely at the changes, I think it would be helpful just to have a quick reminder as to why there was a need. Why did the government think there was a need for change in the first place?
Well, in the private sector, before these reforms, the existing IR35 rules, as it were, mean that, well, they're intended to ensure that where a contractor works via a personal services company for an end user, that's the client, via this personal services company, but otherwise is almost indistinguishable from the client's other employees, the correct amount of tax is deducted from the fee the contractor receives. And so currently the obligation for making sure the correct amount of tax is deducted is on the intermediary, that's the contractor's intermediary. And HMRC and government have been concerned for quite a long time that there's been widespread a lack of compliance with the rules and therefore a consequent significant tax underpayment. And what these rules are designed to do is shift the responsibility for making that determination from the intermediary to the end client, making it much easier for HMRC to enforce.
Which, of course, they'll be particularly keen to do given the state of the nation's finances as a result of COVID.
Yes.
So let's look now at how the new regime will work. Firstly, how does an organisation, how does a client know if it's affected?
Well, basically, if you have anywhere in your supply chain contractors working via intermediaries, then you will be caught. And that can be complex in longer supply chains with a number of different agencies because it may be difficult to identify what kind of arrangement the contractor is working through if you don't directly contract with their intermediary. So if there are a number of agencies in the supply chain.
Okay, but it's worth probably flagging actually at this stage that outsourced services, so outsourced contracts for services, so cleaning, catering and so on, now they're not caught by this, are they?
No, that's right. If you're engaging genuinely business to business, so you're buying a service or an outcome, then these reforms will not apply. They only apply where an engagement is for workers to provide services personally. It's worth saying that there is quite a grey area between what constitutes a genuine outsourced, or there can be a grey area between what constitutes a genuine outsourced arrangement and a labour supply agreement. And HMRC have made it very clear that dressing up a labour supply agreement as a B2B outsourced service is not going to work. So if you've got any doubt that whether you're contracting B2B or not, then you should take advice.
Okay, so outsourced contracts are outside scope, but what sort of arrangements then are caught?
Well, that will be any arrangement in which, as I said, the client has contractors working via intermediaries in their supply chain. So that's going to be basically labour supply chains, whether or not there are a number of different agencies in that supply chain. It could be quite a long supply chain. And that can make it quite difficult to identify both whether there's a relevant intermediary and to make the status determination assessment itself. But we'll come on to that later on, I'm sure.
Yeah. So if an arrangement is caught, if I'm a client and I've got this sort of arrangement with a contractor, what obligations now am I as the client going to be under?
Well, after the 6th of April, first of all, you're going to have to identify arrangements which may be caught. Then you're going to have to determine whether, for tax purposes, the arrangement is inside or outside the reform. So effectively, whether had the contract been between the client and the contractor direct, so without any of the intermediaries, that relationship would be one of employed for tax purposes. So that's the first thing. You're secondly going to have to notify the contractor, and if there's an agency, the first agency in the chain, of that determination. And then thirdly, if you're the fee payer, so if there's no agency, and you determine that the relationship is one of employed for tax purposes, then you will have to deduct PAYE from the fee, and you will also have to account to HMRC for employer NICs and potentially the apprenticeship levy. If you're not the fee payer, so there's an agency intermediary in the chain, then you will notify the agency intermediary of your determination, and it's for the agency intermediary to make the relevant deductions.
Okay, and just looking at that status determination statement, so I've got to make sure I pass that down the chain, haven't I? Because if I don't do that, I become the deemed fee payer, and then I'm going to be responsible for the PAYE. So there is a definite incentive on me to pass that status determination down, I think.
Oh yes, there definitely is. If you don't pass it along, the liability then as fee payer, so that's to account for the PAY, actually stays with you. But there's a bit of a sting in the tail, because if the final agency that pays the intermediary, so that's the fee payer, doesn't account to HMRC properly, then liability bounces back up the chain and actually can still end up with the client, even if the client has done everything it's supposed to.
Okay, yes, sting in the tail is right there. So I'd like to look a bit more closely, Annelise, at how you go about making this status determination statement, because we haven't got time for the nuances on it, but can you give me an overview about how you go about that process?
Yeah, well, firstly, it's important to make clear that this is for tax purposes only. So the status determination is only relevant to tax. It's not an employment status determination. It doesn't relate to employment rights. And secondly, in the tax world, there are only two types of employment. There's employment and self-employment. So there isn't that intermediate status of worker that people will be familiar with in relation to a worker's rights. And it's the relationship, the assessment is the relationship, what's assessed is the relationship between the client and the contractor. So that means that even if there are agencies in between, and there's documentation of contracts in between, whilst those contracts are relevant, they won't necessarily be determinative. And bear in mind, when HMRC checks this sort of stuff, they look at the genuine arrangements on the ground. They're not just looking at the contractual arrangements. And what's being assessed? Well, effectively, there are three things. The relationship that's being looked at, the factors you're looking at are, first, is there personal service? So is the contractor obliged to provide the services personally, or can it sort of contract it out to someone else? Secondly, mutuality of obligation. Now, a lot of people in this space will recognise MOO, and a lot of contractors are very up in arms about it, but it's in relation to the CESS tool. But basically, mutuality of obligation is the obligation on the client to provide work and the obligation on the contractor to do that work. And the third key bit is control. So that's control by the client over the contractor. Is there a sufficient degree of control? And by control, we mean generally who does it, what they do, when they do, how they do it, where they do it. So if those three elements are present, then you look at the rest of the relationship as a whole to see whether there are factors which push more in the direction of self-employment or in the direction of employment. They include the totality of the picture, including, for example, who bears the financial risk? Is there an opportunity for the contractor to profit if he or she does things particularly efficiently? Are they included in employment style benefits? What is the general nature of the relationship? Are there other factors that point away from employment for tax purposes? And that will include their relationship with other organisations and the work they do for other organisations. So that means making the status determination, you may very well have to engage with the contractor because the contractor may have the irrelevant information.
I was going to say the client may not know the answer to some of those questions, might they?
Yeah.
So those are the elements that you've got to take into account, but actually, how do you go about making that assessment?
Well, it's up to you, really. I mean, all you have to do is make the determination and give reasons for why you've made it. But there's no set format. HMRC have got the controversial check employment status for tax tool, which is also known as CESS. Now, it's been revamped in anticipation of these reforms. Essentially, it's an online tool. You answer questions, and at the end of it, it generates what HMRC has said they will accept as a status determination statement. But you must take care with this CESS tool. You need to make sure that you check the very detailed guidelines as to how to answer the questions when you use it. And that's because HMRC have confirmed that if you answer the questions correctly and in accordance with its guidelines, there's no fraud involved, and you haven't structured the contractual arrangements so that they will inevitably get a particular outcome, then HMRC will stand by that determination.
Yes, that's useful if you can use that assess tool then from that perspective.
Yeah,
But
it doesn't necessarily always generate an outcome in every case. So where cases are not, I think it makes sense to use it because HMRC have said that they'll stand behind it. Um, but in certain circumstances, as I said, I think it's about 15% of cases, it doesn't generate an answer. So where things are not clear cut, or if you want to check your arrangements to see whether arrangements entered into in the past are still fit for purpose and what you need, then you should take separate advice.
okay, so it's the client who makes the assessment, but what happens, as I suspect it might happen quite often, if the contractor disagrees with that assessment? How do they go about resolving that potential dispute? Is there a mechanism for that?
Yes, there is. The client, the one who's made the status determination, has to put in place a status determination dispute process. Again,
Actually,
no particular indication as to what that has to look like, so it's up to you to tailor it for your organisation. But what it does mean is that the contractor or the agent, the first agent in the chain, can challenge the status determination statement as made, and then the client must respond within 45 days with a new determination and the reasons for it.
okay, it's slightly strange, isn't it? Because HMRC are the people who will have the final say on whether the SDS is right, but they've got no involvement in the dispute process. So intriguing to see how that will unravel or not unravel, but how that will pan out in time.
Yeah, and I
Um,
should have said, actually, Kate, I should have said that it's important to make sure that you have in place some kind of a review process for the status determination, because I should have mentioned that contractors can actually challenge the status determination at any time during the lifetime of the contract. So,
oh,
and
okay.
you
So
still have to answer. There's no
there's no
cut-off time,
time frames.
no
I
time
know there's
limit.
a time frame for responding, but there's no time frame within which the contractor has to raise a complaint.
As long as the contract is still live, the contractor can raise the complaint. And it's worth remembering that, whatever a relationship starts out like, it kind of tends to morph over time. So
Yeah.
it may be that what was originally assessed as outside IR35 over time, as the person becomes more integrated into the workforce, could become inside. So it's important to put in place a review process to check regularly.
Yes, no, I can see that. And as you've just admirably demonstrated, Annelise, there are lots of implications from an administrative and a compliance perspective around the new regime. But also there are some hard cost implications as well, aren't there?
Yes, I think so, there clearly are. I mean, apart from having to account for PAYE, which is obviously deducted from the fee, the client will have to, if it's the fee payer, will have to account for employer NICs and potentially the apprenticeship levy. And obviously, contractors who are losing out on their fee income may try and pass that back to the end user. So yes, I think there are both costs and administrative challenges ahead.
Yeah. And I suppose there may also be contractors in certain circumstances who actually try and push you to employ them. They may see that there are more benefits in being employed now that this regime is changing than there are to being a contractor. Um, so it's, I suppose that's something else for people to consider. But just before we finish off, Annelise, I wonder if you would be good enough to just summarise in a few sentences what people should be doing now to prepare for these changes, given that we do think they'll be coming in this April.
Yeah, well, as you said at the start, Kate, quite a lot of people have gone quite a long way down the line, getting ready. But of course, their circumstances may very well have changed, will very well have changed over the last 12 months. So it'd be worth reviewing, first of all, to identify arrangements which are caught. So those contractors providing services via an relevant intermediary. So that's number one. Secondly, you need to put in place a status assessment process. You need to make sure that relevant people are trained and up to speed in how to use the assess tool if that's what you're going to use. You need to communicate the status determination both to the contractor and to the first agency in the chain, and then put in place the status disagreement process. You need to make sure, as I said, that you keep the whole process, the whole onboarding process of contractors under regular review, because it changes over time. So it can be quite a challenge. And I think in the face of that challenge, I think, yes, you're right. It may be that for many organisations, they may want to review the way in which they engage contractors going forward and onboard them, and to see whether their current strategy for dealing with contractors is actually satisfies their requirements in the new context.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Annelise. That brings us to the end of our conversation today. If you'd like to know more, you'll find a briefing about IR35 and the changes in the private sector that are coming up on our Burgess Salmon website. Equally, Annelise and the team have had lots of experience of advising clients on the impact of the new IR35 regime, so please do feel free to get in touch with her. She'd be delighted to help. Thank you very much for watching.